meeting is being recorded.
Welcome, everybody. I want to officially welcome Rabbi Rosenfeld all the way from Lisbon in Portugal. And the reason why I have such a broad smile on my face is because we've already been schmoozing now for the last few minutes. And Rabbi Rosenfeld has been telling us about his early days here in Chicago as a student. And it's beautiful to hear all of these stories. But officially, Rabbi Rosenfeld, welcome. And thank you so much for setting aside this time to enlighten us and to inspire us and to tell us about the Jewish community of Lisbon and of Portugal in general. I'm going to put the spotlight on you and welcome aboard. Thank you again.
Well, thank you very much. I feel very welcomed indeed, and very honored to be able to address all of you. And looking forward to sharing some of the really beautiful and meaningful history, Jewish history, that Portugal has, and to share that story of really hundreds of years of Jewish history and how it takes us through the centuries, of course, until the modern era. So you welcomed me to the...
Oh, I'm sorry, Rabbi, I accidentally muted you. Hold on, can you unmute yourself, please?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. No, I'm sorry, I think you are muted again. Please, one more time. I apologize.
Okay now?
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Sure. So you graciously welcomed me, and now I'd like to welcome you to Portugal. And I want to sort of extend a welcome and imagining that all of you were stepping into our Chabad house. And I'll show you the image that I want to share with you of the library of our Chabad house, which we have constructed in a manner to sort of show and project the history of Jewish life in Portugal. So take a look here on the screen. You'll see this is at the entrance of our Chabad house, and you see the library with thousands of books, but primarily you'll see a lot of display cases and shelves which are displaying books, some of which are hundreds of years old. And these aren't just any random Jewish books that happen to be dated, that happen to have that are of a certain age. These are books all telling the story of the Jewish rabbis of Portugal. And through those books, we can sort of take a glimpse, open up the book, if you will, and step into their lives and see a little bit of what Portugal was like back then, bringing us to this current day. So the book that's opened in front of us and that we're looking at is a book called Sefer Mili de Avot, which is a book on Pirkei Avot, traditionally studied during the summer months after Pesach until Rosh Hashanah, where we go through the book that talks about ethics, talks about doing beyond the letter of the law. And this is a classic Jewish text that if you haven't studied it yet with your rabbi, you most definitely should. But what's unique about this book is if you look closely on the title page, I'll zoom in and I'll read it for you. Even if your Hebrew is not great, you can see that this book was written by a rabbi whose name was Yosef. Where my cursor is, you see the word Yosef. His name was Rabbi Yosef Chayun. But look at the next line. It says it was Hebrew. It was composed Lisbona, in the city of Lisbon. So this is a book that was composed here in Portugal, in Lisbon, when Shnat Hey Reish Lamed. Hey Reish Lamed, for those that are good at Jewish math, corresponds to the year 1470. So we're going back now 551 years ago to really what was the beginning of the prime of Jewish life in Portugal. Let's give a little background of what was happening in Portugal at that time. So we're in the year 1470. We're in the second part of the 15th century. We're only 22 years before the famous expulsion of the Jews of Spain. So keep that in mind, because that's going to be a big part of our story. So it's 1470. Rabbi Yosef Chayun is writing his book. And he describes, in the last pages of his book, he describes where he was at this point in time. He says, here I am on the 14th of Tammuz in the year 1470 in Lisbon, Ktseh HaMa'arav, which means the west end. Now think about that. The west end of what? Now today, anyone who looks at a map knows that Portugal, or particularly where our Chabad house is really the furthest, most western point of Europe. In fact, there's a place a few miles away that you go up on a mountain and you reach what is officially the most western point of Europe. But in the year 1470, no one would describe this as the westernmost point of Europe. This was the westernmost point of the world, right? This is 1470. Columbus only sails to America in 1492. So in the end of this book, he describes it as Ktseh HaMa'arav, the West End. And to a certain degree, Portugal was the West End. It was at the far end of Europe. If you came to Portugal, you stopped. That was it. You couldn't go any further. This was the end. The community in Portugal at that time was flourishing. So Rabbi Chayun, the one we've been talking about, was the rabbi of the rabbis. One of his students would go on to become even more famous than his teacher. And that was a rabbi by the name of Rabbi Yitzchak Abarbanel, who would become probably the most, I would say, the most impactful Jewish leader of the late 15th century. Where was he born? He was born right here in Lisbon in the year 1437. And he was a student of this Rabbi Chayun that we were talking about. Now, the Abarbanel, as he's known, would go on to become really famous for many of the books he wrote about the Torah, about philosophy, about Mashiach. But in the 1470s, he was still not yet an accomplished author. He was a thinker, a scholar, but he had no time to really sit and write, because as many of the leading Jewish people at that time, he was very involved in the goings on of the court of the king. The king of Portugal at that time, his name was Afonso V. And he was someone that the Abarbanel was extremely close with. In his writings, the Abarbanel describes the king as a loving, kind king, a benevolent king, beloved to his people, beloved by the Jewish people. And this was the king that the Abarbanel really rose with and became, in that era, one of the greatest financiers of that era. Not only was he dedicated to the court and in the service of the king, he also at one point led a tremendous effort to free many Jewish people who were taken captive and held as slaves for ransom. In his letters, the Abarbanel describes at one point that there was a group of Jews from North Africa who were captured. And curiously, the Abarbanel describes that they were Jews who spoke a foreign language, because in North Africa, they spoke Arabic, a language that a Jew living in what was then Christian Europe could not understand and could not relate to. But nevertheless, a Jew is a Jew. And the Abarbanel and the entire Lisbon Jewish community raised funds, a tremendous amount of money, to have these captives released. So Jewish life in Portugal is on the rise. But then something happens that the Abarbanel describes as catastrophic. It's 1481, and the king, Afonso V, dies. Who takes over? His son, in Portuguese, is called Dom João II, John II. And as kindly and as charitably as the Abarbanel describes the father, it is the polar opposite, night and day, the way he describes the next king. He says someone who was cruel to his own people and terrible to the Jewish people. And what happened was, one of the most powerful dukes of Portugal, who was a very close friend of Abarbanel, was arrested. When Abarbanel heard that news, when Rabbi Yitzchak Abarbanel heard the news that the Duke of Braganza was arrested, he realized that he would be next. So when the king called him to come to his palace, when he was summoned to the king, he realized that he would be in mortal danger if he continued on to the palace after hearing about the arrest of his close friend. Instead, he walked by foot over the border to Spain, to Castilla, right? It wasn't known as Spain yet, never to return to his home country. Just like that, overnight, he left. And for good reason. He was lucky he left because he was right. The king, in his absence, actually had a death sentence issued for the rabbi. And just like that, his entire life's efforts and work disappeared overnight. What did he do? For the first time in his life, he had time. So what does a rabbi do now that he has time? He sat down and wrote a commentary to the book of Joshua, the book of the Judges, the book of Samuel, the book of the Kings, the early prophets. And that's what he spent the next few years working on. But he didn't have time to really get into his literary creations because in a matter of a very short amount of time, he was summoned by the king and queen of Spain, by Ferdinand and Isabella. And in a short time, he became he became employed by them and rose to equal heights in Spain like he did in Portugal. So much so that by the year 1492, when the Jews were expelled from Spain, who was the one meeting with the king and queen, begging them to reconsider, begging them to change their mind, to not expel the Jews from Portugal? There were three rabbis, two that were born in Spain, the third being the Abarbanel. After 3 meetings where he tried all that he could to have the king and queen reconsider, Rabbi Yitzchak Abarbanel, born in Portugal, led the Jews out of Spain right in this time of year, right before Tisha B'Av, and sailed with about 100,000 Jews, left Spain, and he was the leader of the Jews that stood up and said, we are going to remain with our Jewish identity. Unfortunately, those other 2 rabbis that he went with, those other 2 Jewish leaders, were made great offers by the king and queen. Even the Abarbanel was offered a great position if he would just leave his faith and agree to convert. But of course, he would not. And he left Portugal. He left Spain, sailing for Italy, where again, he had to build up. And again, the story continued where this man, this rabbi, this special person never had a moment's rest. Back in Portugal, what was happening? So remember, the Abarbanel left in 1483 from Portugal, never to come back. And now it's 1492. The Jews are expelled from Spain. What's the situation in Portugal? Right, if you look at the map, Portugal and Spain are the only 2 countries in the Iberian Peninsula. Portugal has only one border, just Spain. On the east, it's Spain. On the north, it's Spain. On the west and south, it's the Atlantic Ocean. So what's happening in Portugal in 1492 when the Jews are leaving Spain? Where are they going? If you were in Spain and you were forced to pick another home country, where would you go? So I see someone saying Portugal. And that was the overwhelming choice for Spanish Jews for a couple of reasons. Number one, It's very similar Iberian culture. Number two, it's the easiest to get to. All you have to do is cross a couple of miles in some points, and now you're in Portugal. The estimates are that about 100,000 Jews of Castilla entered Portugal. In the words of the famous Rabbi Abraham Zacuto, who was a famous astronomer, first in Spain, and then became the official astronomer to the kings of Portugal. In fact, his notes, his navigation charts were used by Columbus, was also used by Vasco da Gama, the famous Portuguese navigator who discovered the route to India. He, besides for being famous as an astronomer and a navigator, he was, of course, a famous rabbi. He wrote a book called Yuchsin Hashalem, a book of Jewish history. And he writes, and I quote, Iker Castilla nichnas la Portugal. The bulk of Castilian Jewry entered Portugal. But hold on a second. Wait. Is the situation in Portugal similar to Spain? Is there anti-Jewish sentiment? So let's make this very clear. The Jews are expelled from Spain in 1492. There is already an inquisition in Spain from the 1480s that is pursuing any Jew who has converted. There is already an inquisition there from the 1480s, investigating, right? Looking to see the sincerity of how these people were behaving. Portugal does not have an inquisition until the 1530s. You're talking about 50 years later. So there's a massive discrepancy. There's a massive difference between the history of the Jews of Spain and the history of the Jews of Portugal. 1492, the expulsion from Spain is to a certain degree a buildup of about 100 years of serious anti-Jewish sentiment. The situation in Portugal in the 1480s, even in the early 1490s, is generally positive towards the Jewish community. So where does the bulk of Spanish Jewry come to? They come to Portugal. Now, all of a sudden, a small community that maybe had, I'm not sure, don't quote me on these figures, but maybe had, let's say, 10,000 people, maybe less. Now imagine a community that had 10,000 all of a sudden absorbed 100,000 refugees from another country. How do you think the local Jewish people would feel about these newcomers? How do you think they would react? I mean, this is a great question to think about. How would the old community feel about all these poor newcomers coming in? It's a great question to ponder, but we have clear historical evidence of what took place. Another one of Portugal's great rabbis, whose name was Rabbi David ibn Yahya, he writes that the community as one welcomed in these Jews, took care of them spiritually, physically, whatever they needed, and was dedicated to these Jews that arrived with a full heart, which is amazing, because you cannot take that for granted. Now you could think, they would think, oh, who knows, maybe having all these newcomers arrive, maybe we'll make maybe we'll change our position. Who knows if we'll have, if that will change the local sentiment against us. But no, Rabbi David ibn Yahya tells us that the community in unison was able to welcome these people and take care of them. Unfortunately, this Rabbi David ibn Yahya, wasn't so lucky, because some of the Jews who came from Spain had already, some of them under duress or for whatever reason, converted to Christianity. So you have Jewish people that arrived, that have gone through this baptism process, And now the rabbis in Portugal, the Jews in Portugal, are welcoming them. So this rabbi was accused by the king of sort of being mekarev, if you're familiar with that word, of reaching out and trying to bring close and teach and help these Jews who had gone through a terrible ordeal in Spain. So it was one thing from the perspective of a Catholic king, to welcome in fellow Jews. It was another thing to sort of reach out to people who, in their opinion, had already been converted. So this rabbi was pursued and was looked to be arrested for reaching out to these Jews, and he had to flee Portugal in 1492 because of what happened. However, Jewish life continued, because in 1492, 1493, Jews are still allowed to live in Portugal. And we have here evidence of what Jewish life produced in that era. I'll show you here another element from our library where you see very powerful and beautiful evidence of Jewish life still flourishing at that time. Take a look here on the screen and you'll see a image of, these are two leaves, two folios of a beautiful edition of the book of Yoshua, the book of Joshua, Sefer Yoshua, right, the first book of the early prophets. And this was printed in Portugal. So these leaves, these pages that you're looking at are original. They're back in Portugal now. They were printed in 1494. Here they are. You can see it was printed in 1494 in a city called Leiria, which is about an hour or so north of where I am now. And this is, if you look closely at this, this is an absolute work of art. To think about that 500 years ago, they could produce a page like this. Look at this. There is at least 3 different fonts that they're using. You see the actual text in one font. You have the commentaries in different fonts, both on the left and the right. You have the Targum, the Aramaic translation here in a different font. This is absolutely stunning. If this was printed in this century, you would say it's beautiful, let alone 500 years ago. And these pages, obviously coming from Portugal so long ago, are back home with us now and here in our library. So in the 1490s, Jewish life continues to flourish. Everything's great. But then something happens that's going to change the course of history for the Jews of Portugal. And that is the King of Portugal is getting married. The King of Portugal is now Dom Manuel, King Manuel I. And who does he want to marry? The daughter of the King and Queen of Spain. Now, the King and Queen of Spain had expelled their Jews 5 years before. And who has become the great absorption center for Spanish Jewry? Portugal. You can imagine that these Catholic monarchs were not very happy with Portugal. So they tell Dom Manuel, a condition for the marriage is, you guessed it, you got to expel your Jews. Only one problem. The King of Portugal has no intention of getting rid of the Jews from Portugal. He understands their value and their contribution to Portuguese society. Remember, Portugal is now beginning to become a world superpower. Into the early stages of the next century, it's going to be perhaps the wealthiest country in the world. It discovers the sea route to India, and it takes over the trade that until now was centered in Venice. Until now, if you wanted to bring spices and other goods into Europe, it was all through a land route that would basically come through Venice. And that was it. There was no other way to bring these goods to Europe. All of a sudden, Portugal is going to discover the route to India, and it's going to become one of the wealthiest countries in the world. But who is really at the forefront And really in the mix in all of this, it's the Jews of Portugal. We mentioned Rabbi Zacuto, but he's not the only one. There's so many others that are part of this, that are part of these discoveries. So the king of Portugal has to make an uncomfortable choice. He either can marry the daughter of the king and queen of Spain, or he has to get rid of his Jews. How can he do both? So he comes up with a really, really cruel solution to his dilemma. What is he going to do? He's going to follow the example of Spain. He's going to expel the Jews from Portugal. But with one major difference. He's not going to let the Jews leave Portugal. Yeah, you heard me right. He's going to expel the Jews from Portugal, but he's not going to let them leave Portugal. And still, he'll be left without any Jews. What is he going to do? He intends to convert the Jews of Portugal against their will to Christianity. This is what he does. And the next part of the story I'm going to tell you is told to us by Rabbi Abraham Saba, who was a Spanish rabbi who was from Zamora. You look on the map, you see where Zamora is. It's not very far from the Portuguese border. And he came to Portugal in the 1490s, where he settled for many years, writing books, writing comments to the Torah. And this is what happened. There was an announcement made that the Jews have 11 months to leave Portugal. In late 1496, it's announced the Jews have 11 months to leave Portugal. 11 months, it's a long time. In Spain, they were given only 3 months. 11 months. And the announcement is told, any Jew who wants to leave, there will be boats waiting for them at their location of choice. He gave them 3 locations: Porto, Lisbon, Setúbal, and the boats will take you to wherever you want to go. However, as time progressed, the announcement was changed. No, there's not going to be any boats in Porto. There won't be any boats in Setúbal. All the boats will be waiting in Lisbon. And if you come to Lisbon, you'll be taken to where you want to go. So, Rabbi Abraham Saba, he was forced to leave Spain. Now he's going to leave Portugal. But the king of Portugal had other plans. First thing they did, they made an announcement. Anybody who's caught with Jewish books, every Jewish book is going to be confiscated. Synagogues need to be closed. Jewish children were abducted and taken from their parents, converted against their will. The logic being, well, if we take the children, probably the parents will follow. A horrific scene unfolded as children, young teenagers are taken from their parents. A terrible scene unfolds. But it gets worse. The Jews come to Lisbon, expecting to find boats. Instead, there's no boats. Tens of thousands of Jews are gathered into one square. There is baptismal waters sprinkled upon them, as Rabbi Saba and others describe them as the Mayim Hazedonim, quoting King David, like cursed waters are sprinkled upon them. And now they're told, okay, you're no longer Jewish. You can all go back home. You can't leave. The king of Portugal has now fulfilled his objective. There are no Jews in Portugal, in his estimation. But did any Jews leave? No. Did the Jewish people stop behaving as Jews? No. It's a completely different story from that which took place in Spain 5 years before. In Spain 5 years earlier, any Jewish person who wanted to leave Spain had the ability to. Almost nobody had the ability to leave Portugal during those years. Now, we know stories of certain rabbis that did leave in very terrible conditions. Rabbi Zakuto himself managed to leave. You've heard of Rabbi Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch. So his uncle at that point was living in Portugal, was a Rosh Yeshiva, head of the Torah Academy in Portugal. He was able to leave, but it wasn't easy. Rabbi Karo tells us in the journey leaving Portugal, every single one of his sons died. These were really dangerous trips, not easy. But those people who left were the ultimate minority. Only a small fragment of the Jewish population left. The majority were stuck in Portugal. What about Rabbi Saba that we mentioned? Rabbi Saba had his library taken away from him, of course. Like every Jewish person, he had all his Hebrew books taken away from him. But he had a few manuscripts that he personally had been working on for the last 5 years at least, that he could not part with. They were so important to him, so special to him. Imagine, for 5 years of his life, he was working on writing a commentary to the Torah. He wasn't going to give that up. So he kept it with him, endangering his life. He tells us that when he got to Lisbon, a rumor began to circulate that anyone who's caught with Jewish literature or Jewish objects, manuscripts, tefillin, anything, will be killed. What did Rabbi Saba do? He took his precious manuscripts. He went and found an olive tree outside the city of Lisbon and buried his manuscript inside the root of an oliveira. It's the Portuguese word for an olive tree, eight zayit for an olive tree, hoping to one day come back and dig up the Torah that he deposited there. But that never happened. He was found, he was taken to jail. Miraculously, he was one of the tiny minority that managed to escape Portugal. And on a rickety boat, he was able to cross to Morocco, where he almost died after his journey. But when he got up from his sickbed, he decided that everything that he lost in Portugal, he was going to write again. Imagine, he had just worked for 5 years with a massive library. And again, this is the 1490s. Books are not easy to come by. He's been working for 5 years, writing his life's, this is his magnum opus. This is his life's work. And now it disappeared. It's gone. But he decided that he was going to write it again. And he did. He sat down and wrote his Torah commentary again from memory. But this time, it's a very different commentary. When you read his rewritten commentary, very often he says, on this pasuk or this parsha, I can't remember, but I remember that I used to have a beautiful commentary here, but my svarim, my books, my manuscripts were lost in Portugal. I can't remember it. Throughout the book, he references what happened to him in Portugal. Another instance, for example, when it comes to this week's parsha is going to cover the Shema Yisrael. So in his commentary, Rabbi Saba says, why do the Jewish people need one verse that's like a headline prayer? We have so many different beautiful verses. Why do we need one that's like a headline for all? He says, I'll tell you, I never knew the reason until my experiences in Portugal, because I realized that when they take away our synagogues, they take away our teachers, they take away our books, they take away everything we have. What can't they take away from us? Shema Yisrael, that's inscribed on our heart. And this is what he writes. And he references again and again his experiences in Portugal. This book that he rewrote was printed shortly after he passed away. And I'll show you a copy of the first edition of this book. It's called the Tzror Hamor. This is it. It was printed in 1523 by the famous printer of Hebrew books, Daniel Bomberg. He printed this in 1523 in Venice. It's the most beautiful, beautiful book. You can see the very elaborate letters here for the word Vayikra. And this is Rabbi Saba's book that was reprinted, but this one has many references to Portugal. For example, take a look at this page. You see this? Can you see the screen now? You see this book here. This is also Rabbi Saba's book, not the first edition. This is the third edition from 1567. But you can see it looks like somebody spilled coffee on it, right? Nobody spilled any coffee on this book. This book went through heavy censorship for anything that a Christian censor might find objectionable. If you see my cursor hovering over this line here, that word that's erased says Portugal. What would be objectionable about the word Portugal? I'll tell you. It says on that line, he says, what happens when people take away our tefillin? Like it happened in the times of the Talmud and happened in Portugal. And apparently the censor felt that that wasn't a good reflection on a Catholic country, and they took some dark ink to erase it. But what's amazing is that after close to 500 years, the dark ink that was spilled on these words, the dark ink of hate, has begun to fade. So when you open this book now, instead of these words being erased, they're actually the first words that catch your attention. It's almost as if they're highlighted. And I think it's a very powerful analogy to the story of the Jewish people as well, because hate and dark ink that's poured on letters of light eventually will fade. But the words of Torah and our neshama, our faith, our identity, that has remained. And indeed, back in Portugal today, here is this book available for anyone who wants to study. When the rabbi approached me earlier about giving the lecture tonight, the idea was to talk about our history and our modern day Jewish community. But to me, really, they're part of one story. Because when we sit down to study Torah, we gravitate naturally to the Torah commentaries of our Portuguese rabbis, because it's their life and their inspiration that we look to, and the choices and the life choices we make, and the way of life that we want to live. Who do we look to for strength and encouragement? To these rabbis that lived in the country where we do, looking to them for inspiration. Rabbi Saba survived. Others who lived their life for Torah and mitzvot weren't as fortunate. I'll show you another book here. This is a book that was printed by another Portuguese rabbi. His name was Rabbi Shlomo de Oliveira. Oliveira is a very typical Portuguese Jewish name. This is a book published in Amsterdam, where many of the Portuguese Jews moved to. In fact, if you look around historically at most of the Western Jewish communities, South America, North America, many parts of Europe, who are the Jews who founded these communities? The first Jews were generally Portuguese Jews. The first Jewish community in the Americas was in Recife by Portuguese Jews. In North America, you look at the Toro Synagogue in Rhode Island. You look at many of the first Jewish communities around the world were founded by Portuguese Jews. So this was written by a Portuguese rabbi living in Amsterdam. And this is a book of poems. And this one here, Anshe Emunah, Men of Faith, as you can see, was dedicated to a young man called Yitzchak de Castro. What happened to Yitzchak de Castro? You see here the description that says, Asher Chai b'la'u lahavot ish, who was consumed alive by the fire. Al yichud kedushat Hashem, for sanctifying God's name. V'yatsa nishmato akdosha b'tahara, and his soul left his body in purity. This Yitzchak de Castro was a Jew who was arrested in Brazil, which was controlled then by the Portuguese in Salvador, and sent back to Lisbon, where he was executed at an auto de fe. And in his files of the Inquisition, do you know what the evidence against him was? What was the evidence against him? He was caught with a pair of tefillin. A pair of tefillin was caught and was used as evidence that he was a practicing Jew. So the next time the rabbi comes to visit any of you and says, gentlemen, tefillin today? Think about Yitzchak de Castro. Think about all of these Jews who lived and died to put on tefillin. And think about how free we are today, how lucky we are today to be able to do mitzvahs, to be able to live the life that we want to, and never take for granted the freedom that we have, and to always remember those that lived these amazing lives, to take inspiration from them. Here in Portugal, when I meet someone and say, would you like to put on tefillin? I tell them, think about what we are doing now. Think about the souls of those who are watching us from heaven, how proud of us they may be. It is a very empowering thought as we live as proud Jews today. Just want to conclude with one more element, bringing the story, really, the story of Jewish Portugal to modern times. And that is that, Portugal, for centuries, was a place where you could not openly practice Judaism. It would take us until the 19th century until the Inquisition is formally stripped of its powers and ceases to exist. Hundreds of years. In the 20th century, Portugal again plays a very powerful role in the course of Jewish history as World War II begins, because Portugal is a neutral country in Europe during the war, which means that it was the only place where Jews could escape to be able to find safe passage to the United States or to other countries. In June of 1941, the Lubavitcher Rebbe arrived to Lisbon. He had been living in France, which was, of course, very dangerous, with the Nazis occupying France. And miraculously, he was able to come to Lisbon. And here in Lisbon, he received tickets and a visa to be able to travel safely to New York. And on June 12th, 1941, the Rebbe and his wife, the Rebbetzin, left Portugal on the Serpa Pinto boat, traveling to New York, where they arrived 11 days later. And just to show you one more display case that we have in the library, which is the last element of the display, is this window here. And if you can see on the right where my mouse is, those are those Hebrew words. That manuscript is a copy of what the Rebbe wrote in Lisbon. These are words that were written here in Portugal in 1941. And what do you think the Rebbe wrote about as the world is burning, as the world is in chaos? The day before he embarked on this boat, you see this postcard here. This is a postcard from the Serpa Pinto, the boat that brought the Rebbe to safety in New York. What do you think the Rebbe wrote about in such a world? The Rebbe wrote about what a beautiful, perfect world is going to look like. The Rebbe wrote about a passage in Talmud that discusses the coming of Mashiach and how the world can be not a place of chaos and not a place of uncertainty, but a place of beauty, a place of light, and the spiritual perfection that God wants it to be, and what the world will be like with the coming of Mashiach. That's what the Rebbe wrote here in Lisbon in 1941. So I just want to conclude with a thanks to the Rabbi for the invitation, and a thanks to all of you for being here and hearing our story. And of course, I want to extend an invitation. If anybody has the opportunity to travel to Portugal, we'd welcome you with open arms. Show you our Chabad house in the flesh and blood. Welcome you in. Offer you a cup of tea or a coffee, and of course the opportunity to wrap tefillin and study some Torah. So thank you all. If anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to answer as many as we have time for.
I'm sure that we have a lot of questions. Rabbi Rosenfeld, that was absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much. It was enlightening and inspiring. It exceeded all expectations. I'm very curious, if I could just throw in a question before anyone else does. What was it like amassing the library? Was that amassed piece by piece, or did it come to you?
Absolutely. It's been a passion of many in our community, with the objective of very simply bringing the rabbis of Portugal back to Portugal, to give these rabbis their voice. In other words, very often ancient books or historical elements are treated just as that, as historical elements. And our perspective has been, no, these are books that were written to teach Torah. These rabbis live their lives as teachers, right? That's the meaning of the word rabbi. And we need to give them back their voice in their home country. And our objective has been to let these rabbis' voices be heard once again every Torah class we have. So of course we look at Rashi, and of course we're in our Chabad, we always want to know, what does the Rebbe have to say about the Parsha? But we want to know, what do the Portuguese rabbis have to say? And that is something that is very empowering to our community. And many different members of our community have been part of this process of finding these books, some in Israel, some in New York, some in other places of Europe, bringing them back together. And our objective is to have every single rabbi of Portugal to have all of their books here.
It's amazing. Is there a way that we can access online to browse through, to look through, to become more familiar with those particular books?
That is our goal, but we're not there yet. Give us some time.
Okay. All right, let's throw it open to the floor. If anyone has any questions, please go ahead and unmute yourself. You can press the space bar on your computer, or if you're on the phone, you can press star and then 6, and then just go ahead.
Hello, Rabbi Rosenfeld. Thank you so much. I am just absolutely intrigued. My daughter spent a few weeks in Portugal earlier this summer, and I'm planning to, God willing, if my health holds, be in Portugal in the wintertime. And I want to know where, in addition to Lisbon, are there Jewish communities, even small Jewish communities, even Jewish communities that have ancient cemeteries?
What I'll do is I'll share with the rabbi my contacts. I'll give him my email.
Perfect.
and my telephone number, and I'll be happy to share all information with you.
You want to come closer so they can hear you?
Thank you.
I can build it down.
All right, we have a question here. Go ahead.
Rabbi, you'll have to excuse me. I came a few moments late after you started, but I was wondering how the Portuguese government responded to Jewish people in the Second World War. Did they turn them over to the Nazis like other countries had?
Portugal during the Second World War was a place of refuge for tens of thousands of Jews. In fact, I highly recommend searching to read about Aristides de Sousa Mendes, who was the Portuguese consul of Bordeaux, who probably was saved, if not the most, maybe second most Jews during the war of any person. He issued tens of thousands of visas, Portuguese visas, which allowed Jews to travel from Belgium, from France to Portugal, and survive. So Portugal was at that time one of the lone bright spots on the continent, where tens of thousands of Jews found safe passage and survived because of Portugal. There's a lot of dark parts of the Portuguese Jewish history, but there's a lot of bright spots.
I'm impressed.
And how about today? What's the attitude of the Portuguese people today towards the Jewish people, towards Israel? What is it like there?
So actually, a couple of years ago, we finished a project before the library opened. Actually, we finished a project of publishing a book of the Torah thoughts on the Torah, every parsha, a couple of divrei Torah, a couple of ideas of the rabbis of Portugal, and we published this in Portugal, in Portuguese and English, and the president of Portugal wrote the foreword.
Wow.
Yeah, he wrote the foreword, illustrating and highlighting how important the Jewish contribution to Portugal is, and how it's essential that the local people know this part of the story. If you want to look for the book, it's called Jewish Voices from Portugal. You can find it on Amazon.
We have one more question. Go ahead, Rita.
Okay. Do they have a lot of kosher restaurants in Portugal? Is it hard to get kosher food there?
It's getting easier.
Yeah.
Today we have there's now a couple of places where you can eat kosher in Portugal. Again, anyone who's planning on visiting, seriously, get in touch with me, and I'll send you all the information. But yes, it's getting easier.
That's wonderful. I have another question. What would you say is the number of Jews in Portugal today?
Great question. It's really hard to give a firm number on how many Jews are in Portugal today, because the community has been growing a lot the last couple of years.
Right.
I don't know if you've read about the law that was passed in Portugal a number of years ago that allows Jews who can trace their ancestry back to Portugal from the expulsion, they have the right to regain Portuguese nationality. And as of today, I think about 70,000 people have claimed nationality based on that law. The majority don't settle in Portugal, they just receive the nationality. However, that has been a big, that has caused and been a big push for one of the reasons why the community has grown in the last couple of years.
Yes, wonderful.
Are those people halachically Jewish?
Are descendants of the Jews from the expulsion Jewish?
No,
some are, some aren't.
Right. Okay. Well, that's very interesting. 70,000. I wouldn't have guessed that it would be such a large number.
The majority of the people who have gained nationality are living in Israel. So I assume a very big percentage of them are indeed.
I couldn't trace my family back 500 years.
Yeah, but if you were a Sephardic Jew,
Yeah.
your last name would be an indication pretty much of you where the family was. For example, the name Abarbanel was Portuguese 500 years ago and still exists today.
Mhm.
The name Abuav or Abu Draham or the common Sephardic names have been with families for centuries. In the Ashkenazi world, it's much harder because we didn't have last names till very recently.
Fascinating.
Absolutely wonderful. Wonderful information. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, once again, we don't want to take up too much of your time, Rabbi Rosenfeld, but it's been a true pleasure. And I think that this class recording will be one of the very popular ones on our website. And hopefully the information and the inspiration gets spread and is enjoyed by many more people. So thank you again. And I hope that we can meet one day, if not in Portugal, maybe in Chicago, or the best thing would be to meet in Israel with the coming of Mashiach. So hopefully that will be very soon.
Be'ezrat Hashem, and there's no reason you can't make a stop on the way. We're on the way to Israel.
You might get there before us then, in that case.
Yeah.
All right. Be well, everybody, and we'll see you next time.
Yes.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.